Well, welcome back to the Equip for Life podcast. I am here with the amazing Emily Geiger and Rebecca Carlson. And my job at this point is to give the hosting seat over to Emily, because the whole point of this episode is for me to not really be at all prepared for what we're going to talk about. You guys know what we're talking about. I don't know what's happening because I'm supposed to react to cool things that are going on. So, Emily, I don't know what else to say. Take it away.
Amazing. So we're here today to talk about IVF, primarily to help pro-lifers think well about how to respond to concerns that pro-choice people have, and honestly concerns a lot of pro-life people have, and just plain Americans have, about what's happening with IVF, what's going on with like the Trump administration and IVF. Should we be encouraging IVF? Should we not be encouraging IVF? Because we've been getting this question a lot. Like us, in our work on college campuses and in our work with the affiliate group program, our affiliate groups are getting this question a lot. Because I think, frankly, IVF is a very confusing topic for multiple reasons. I mean, first of all, I think a lot of people don't even know what IVF is. They just have this vague concept that if someone is struggling to get pregnant, we can do IVF, and then oftentimes they get pregnant. And yay, I mean, that's awesome, right? So that's pretty much as deep as most people's understanding of IVF is. I mean, that's as deep as my understanding of IVF was for like a long time, because we just don't like talk about IVF in society, right? So I think it's confusing, A, because of that, because people just don't know a lot about it. And then B, because it seems to be, based on the description I just gave, really awesomely in line with what pro-life people want. Because as far as pro-choice people are concerned, the whole reason that we are pro-life is because we love babies and we want there to be more babies. We want people to be having babies. And so it seems really weird that we maybe wouldn't be supporting IVF. And so we were hearing a lot of confusion from people, especially on college campuses, asking questions to our affiliate groups. And we wanted to help our people think about this question better and think about how to communicate concerns we have about IVF in a way that's going to really allow pro-choice people to hear you, just like we want them to hear us when we talk about abortion and we talk about kind of what rhetoric you should use, what practical dialogue tips you should use, what arguments you should use in order to help them get their walls down and hear you. I think that we have to have similar strategies for this, even more so because it's so confusing and because our concerns about IVF are so contrary to maybe what this pro-choice person would naturally think you would believe, essentially. So we did a thing earlier this semester. Everything I want to like preface, everything we're going to talk about comes from this thing. We did this really cool thing where Rebecca and I and our other coaches at ERI got on a Zoom call that was open to all of our affiliate groups, and tons of people from different clubs came on, and we basically had an epic brainstorming session with
what are affiliate groups? You're going to have to, because we haven't talked about affiliate groups hardly at all on the podcast or in a long time. Point. So like you're talking about coaches, I don't think most people would necessarily know. So we don't need to go into a whole deep thing, but like explain what are you talking about real quick?
Totally. Great point. So, okay, we at ERI have something called the affiliate group program, which I describe as a personalized mentorship program meant for localized pro-life groups. So we have done this for many years. We've provided kind of mentorship to other groups or pro-life training or consulting. And it started out being mostly larger pro-life groups, right? Other national organizations or even localer organizations, but that like have budgets to pay us to do consulting and assistance with them. We would do that kind of thing. And then we realized, mainly when I came on staff, I realized, hey, there's a whole bunch of local tiny pro-life groups like college pro-life clubs that really would love to have that level of mentorship and support from ERI, but they don't have the money to pay for that. And so I want to come up with a program where those groups can sign up and get personalized mentorship from us completely for free. But in exchange, their skin in the game is they're going to promise to actually use our materials. They're going to promise to really learn apologetics, to become experts at it, to be out in their community, actually using this material to change hearts and minds. Because if they're willing to do that, my goodness, we're willing to provide them all of the free mentorship and support if they are actually going to use it and get awesome pro-life things happening in their community. So that's what the affiliate group program is it's this personalized mentorship program where local pro-life groups, that sounds like college pro-life clubs, but it also sounds like high school pro-life clubs. It's local church pro-life groups or respect life committees, things like that. Any small local pro-life group can sign up to be part of our program. And they get access to all of our ERI materials. They get free access to our courses, and they get a club coach who is someone at ERI who really knows this material super well and is going to help them learn it effectively and help them run an effective pro-life club. So we both have on-staff club coaches like myself. I run the affiliate group program. I also have a slate of clubs that are on my personal coaching roster. Rebecca has a slate of clubs on her personal coaching roster. And we also have club coaches that aren't full-time staff at ERI, but who are paid side stipend employees who have typically run an awesome ERI affiliate group before. Now they've graduated from that. They're fantastic. And we want to keep them going and help them to be able to help other clubs. So we have this whole slate of club coaches. It's awesome. And so when I say we did this really cool thing earlier this semester, what I mean is that those kids in those pro-life clubs all across the country in our affiliate groups got on this call with us and with the coaches. And we had this epic, awesome brainstorm session about, okay, what are you hearing on your campuses about IVF? Why are people confused? What is this whole executive order thing that Trump even signed earlier this year? How can we work together? Because I'm not an expert on IVF. I do not spend all day thinking about IVF. None of us do. We spend all day thinking about abortion. We have many thoughts about IVF. I've answered many a Q&A question and a speech about IVF, but I am not an expert in how to do this because I don't typically talk about it. None of us are. And so we wanted to have this epic brainstorm session so that we could think through with our smartest students, with our students that are out there in the field every day having these conversations. What are you hearing? How can we respond? Let's go back and forth and try to come up with some best practices about how to think about this issue. And then we turned that into an article that we're going to be publishing that Rebecca and I have been working on and into this podcast. We want to be able to give you all of those ideas. And think of the article as just a shorter, condensed, like highlight reel version. Here we're going to be able to have a really good discussion about it. Josh has not heard this, as you mentioned.
Nope.
So we want to get Josh's live thoughts to our thoughts and our college students' thoughts. And so this is going to kind of give people a much more in-depth kind of behind the scenes. How do we brainstorm even about new topics and think about how to communicate when these aren't, issues we've been thinking about tons and tons for years and years and years. And then we've got that article that's the more condensed, like highlight reel. Here's the key points that you want to take away from this. So that's what we did earlier this semester. That's kind of how we're coming into today.
Okay, so that sounds fabulous. I think I only have one clarification question to help set the table for myself and potentially for the listeners as you get into it. The one kind of clarification question I have in my mind that I imagine would be in a lot of people's minds is one of the things that makes ERI awesome is we have this really diverse staff in a lot of ways. We're politically diverse, we're religiously diverse. So we have a Catholic person on this podcast right now and 2 Protestants, and we're talking about IVF. And I imagine you had a bunch of Protestants and Catholics in these clubs. And of course, as many, non-religious people as we can find or other non-Christians. We welcome all. We love you, but you probably had a lot of Protestants and Catholics on this. Mm-hmm. And sometimes Protestants and Catholics have differing views on IVF, or at least parts of IVF. And so are you was that a challenge? And is this coming from a Catholic or a Protestant perspective? Where is this kind of coming from?
Rebecca, I feel like you should
take I can take that.
Nice.
This was something that the groups that I worked with were particularly focused on just because of how we split up what students were focused around, which topics. We kind of did focus groups in this call. And I think it kind of comes down to a similar thing to what so I'm Protestant, Emily's Catholic. And I think one of the things I admire a lot about Catholic pro-lifers is that they're often really, really good about distinguishing between different types of concerns, particularly when it comes to things like birth control. So I've heard a lot of Catholic pro-lifers say, yeah, I wouldn't take birth control. I don't want to be required to provide birth control because that goes against my conscience, or at least particular forms of birth control. But I see that as in a very different category from abortion. I don't think using a condom is committing a human rights violation. I don't think that's the kind of thing that should be against the law for other people to do. And so I think there are some ways that Catholics and Protestants, particularly Protestants because of course Protestants are diverse theologically too.
Sure, yes.
All right, so some Protestants will lack some concerns about IVF that some Catholics have. But I think every pro-lifer who understands enough about what IVF is should have some really significant concerns. And so I think it was actually really helpful to have a diversity of perspectives on the affiliate group call and have our awesome club members helping us out to kind of narrow down, okay, what are the things that we should all agree on? And I think those actually end up being the most important concerns because, spoiler alert, we'll get into this in a minute. But I think there are some significant human rights violation kind of concerns about IVF. And then there are also concerns that some Catholics have and some Protestants have to varying degrees, and that the Catholic Church has about IVF that are separate. And I think it's helpful to understand both of those things, and also really helpful to be very clear both in our own heads and in how we talk about it publicly that those are separate things.
Yeah. Okay. I'm super in. Take it away. I don't have any other questions. Teach me what you all figured out.
So I want to frame us for a second about why we're actually having this conversation right now. Because I do hear some other pro-life person in my head saying, hey, Emily, you mentioned the Trump's executive order thing. I'm sorry, that happened in February. Why are we recording this podcast today? Today is in the middle of May. Right. I don't know exactly when this is going to come out, but
actually go out, right?
We're a little late in talking about it. No, we are not. I want to be very clear about something. Trump's executive order, contrary to what I thought on February 18th when he released the executive order, because there was so much pandemonium in my social media feed that I genuinely thought that Trump's executive order had accomplished something about IVF. Like, Trump has made it quite clear through his whole campaign trail that he is very supportive of IVF. He wants to make IVF more accessible, more affordable. He said things like he wants to make it available in every state in America for free.
Didn't he say he wants to be the grandfather of it, or grandfather of IVF?
He says that he wants to be I think it was the grandfather of IVF. I would have to check that exact quote.
We really are the party for IVF. We want fertilization, and it's all the way.
Tonight, former President Donald Trump under fire after making this strange claim about in vitro fertilization to an all-female town hall.
Oh, I want to talk about IVF. I'm the father of IVF, so I want to hear this question.
But he has said many things about, he wants to be known as the fertility president. I think that's an exact quote of a thing that he said. Okay.
DBW. Okay.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
Major DBW.
But yes, but he's been very clear on this.
He's been very clear. All along, I support IVF, and he wants to, make this a thing. Here, I can actually even grab, he did promise on the campaign trail, he promised public funding or mandated insurance coverage for IVF. So that's specifically
I don't even know if I knew that he made that
okay,
promise.
I knew that. That's what I assumed when I saw the pandemonium in my social media feed. And I honestly think a lot of other people assumed that. When he put down this executive order on February 18th about IVF, my brain instantly went to, he's doing it. He is mandating public funding or mandating insurance coverage for IVF. That's what it is. And that is what I think the concept a lot of people had gotten from hearing there was an executive order. He's doing something like that.
Yeah.
The executive order did nothing. Let me be very clear. Go read it. Okay. This is something, side note. I'm very passionate about this. Anytime that a pro-choice person or a pro-life person or anyone, to be honest, tells you that a thing like a law or an executive order or a whatever, they claim that thing does something or says something, please go read the actual executive order. I have made this mistake so many times about so many things, okay? Because I didn't go read this executive order for a month afterwards. I just kind of assumed that he had done this because I had heard about it through the news and everyone was freaking out. I didn't know what it did and I didn't pay any attention. And then I finally went and read it when we held our all affiliate group workshop on Zoom a month later. And I read it and I went, oh, this executive order does not mandate insurance coverage. This does not mandate public funding. It literally does nothing. I'm going to give you an exact quote. This is what is in the executive order. This is the important part. It says, within 90 days of the date of this order, which was February 18th, within 90 days of the date of this order, the assistant to the president for domestic policy shall submit to the president a list of policy recommendations on protecting IVF access and aggressively reducing out-of-pocket and health plan costs for IVF treatment.
They have to present a list of suggested?
A list of suggestions. Yes. Within 90 days, you have to present a list of suggestions. That is what he is requiring in the executive order, which is why we are not late in talking about this. Today, the day we are recording this is day 85. And these policy recommendations are required to be submitted by day 90. So this is about to come back up in the news cycle. And that is why now is the important time to be talking about this.
Wow.
Because I can tell you, as soon as he reviews these policy recommendations, which I don't know how quickly he's going to, but he's going to review them. And presumably, Trump is going to pick one of them to try, or multiple of them to try from the recommendations.
Yeah.
And then, boom, we're going to be back in this conversation again. So that's why I actually think right now is the more important time to be having this conversation, not back in February 18th when Trump put in an order that actually did nothing. It just said, please present to me policy recommendations. That's what he was asking for. And so we need to be ready for that next round of the news cycle, which is why Rebecca and I were prioritizing this article to be coming out right about now. And that article is probably going to come out before this podcast. You're going to have that out available to you, and then you're going to have this longer form discussion.
But if you haven't seen it, there'll be a link to it in the description, I'm sure.
Absolutely. So that's why we're talking about this.
Nice.
Rebecca, I think it'd probably be most helpful for us to start in kind of like describing those two camps. Let's talk about like what IVF is and why we have concerns about it before we kind of get into maybe how to talk about those concerns in a conversation.
Yeah, so we've teased this a little bit over the last 15 minutes. But like you said at the beginning, like on paper, IVF sounds great. There's this like not magical, but like scientific process that happens, and when people can't get pregnant, and then they can get pregnant, and both pro-life people and pro-choice people should be on board with that. Like pro-life people should want people who want to be able to get pregnant, and pro-choice people should want people who want to be able to get pregnant to have that choice. It's a whole choice thing. Pro-choice people aren't like anti-babies, they're pro-choice. And pro-life people, I think sometimes even get misinterpreted as like being pro-babies, like we need more babies in the world, so we need to outlaw abortion for that reason. That's not actually what we're about. And it's actually, I think, an indication and an opportunity to communicate like pro-life consistency, to say, if all I wanted was more babies in the world, I would be on board with any method of making that happen, including IVF. But what being pro-life is really centrally about is not, I want there to be more babies. It's, I don't want us to kill babies who already exist. I don't want us to kill prenatal humans who already exist. And the way that IVF is typically practiced, it involves killing prenatal humans who already exist. That sounds really weird because like you're making new babies. Like the purpose of this is why would this process involve?
Yeah. So
here's how IVF is typically done. The short answer is because IVF doesn't have anything like 100% success rate. It is very difficult to even like, so a round of treatment is often very expensive. Trump is right about that. And involves typically creating more embryos than you are going to implant so that you can pick the ones that look the healthiest or the best to implant in the woman's uterus. So you take sperm and egg from the man and the woman, either married couple or people who want to parent together, or from donor eggs and or sperm. And you use those to fertilize an egg and create an embryo in the lab. You do that multiple times, and then you implant a subset of those embryos in the woman's uterus. And the other embryos you either freeze for possible use later or potentially to be discarded, that is killed later, or you just discard, that is kill immediately. Because even a human embryo who's created in a lab is a human being, is a living organism of the human species. And we at ERI and we in the pro-life movement believe that all humans, regardless of how they came to exist and regardless of their level of development or their age, have an equal right to be protected from violence. So that includes humans who were created in a lab or who were brought to be in a lab setting. And I think it is wrong and a human rights violation to freeze or discard those humans. And then there's an additional step that we have talked about in the past. So once you implant embryos in the woman's uterus, typically not all of those embryos will survive. And that's tragic, but not inherently a human rights violation, of course. Like implanting humans in a uterus, knowing that they might not survive, that happens in natural pregnancy too. Miscarriage is incredibly common in pregnancy through typical older means. And so it's, I think I want to be clear that I'm not saying because IVF involves implanting embryos in a uterus, knowing that they might not survive, that's a human rights violation. That's not what I'm saying. However, typically in IVF, because it's so expensive, because the failure rate is high, they will implant more embryos than they want to survive. So they might implant, I'm making up numbers here, but like 3 embryos and want this woman to have a singleton. And maybe it turns out that actually 2 of those embryos survive. I think often the numbers are higher than that because the failure rate and the chances that this embryo will die in utero are higher than that. So if more embryos than they want to survive do survive and look like they're going to thrive, then they will do what is called selective reduction, which is abortion. It is identical to the same method is used in other abortion cases in order to get the number of embryos in the uterus down to the number that the woman wanted. And that like it is safer for those embryos, and I believe to some degree for the woman as well, to have fewer embryos in her uterus. But of course, just like with abortion, setting up a scenario where you are planning to kill people, to kill prenatal humans, is not okay.
I want to pause us right there. There are pro-lifers that I imagine or heard all of that and just like need a second to digest because maybe they weren't aware exactly all the things that go down in IVF. And I also want to take a second for the pro-lifers that maybe are very familiar with IVF to recognize the gravity of what Rebecca just said, both because it is extremely serious what we're talking about here and extremely tragic that this is common practice in our society, and because what Rebecca just said should in and of itself be sufficient reason to say that IVF, at least as it is currently practiced in the United States, is wrong and should not be legal. There are a lot of other reasons that I hear pro-lifers bring up for why IVF is wrong, kind of that secondary bucket of concerns that often come from Catholics like me. And we're going to talk about those. We're going to get to those in a second. But what Rebecca just said is something that we can all agree on. And frankly, that secondary bucket of concerns shouldn't be necessary when we have that first bucket. Yeah. Because that is extremely serious. We have a whole industry that is built on deliberately creating extra humans that we know we are going to kill and then actually killing them. So I think the next question to me is, if we understand how problematic IVF is in at least the way that it's currently functioning, that kind of first bucket of primary concerns, how do we effectively communicate that to a pro-choice person? Yeah. And I want to kind of start with the hardest kind of pro-choice person I think that there is, which maybe there's 2 in this case, but someone whose life has been directly affected by IVF. Because we talk to a lot of pro-choice people who maybe know someone who has struggled with infertility and either are trying IVF right now, they have used IVF, or maybe they're about to and they're struggling with this. And it can come across like if we say, hey, IVF is wrong because it involves all of these things, that sounds like you're not super compassionate for the person who is struggling to get pregnant. Yeah. And I've also had the experience on my own old college campus of talking to someone who brought up the fact that they were an IVF baby. They were conceived from IVF. And they literally said, I wouldn't exist if it wasn't for IVF. Do you wish that I didn't exist? They asked me that exact question. It's like, wow, if you don't come across, like if you come at this from the wrong direction, it's very much going to sound like I am saying that person's life isn't valuable. Yeah. So how do we go about bringing up those concerns without making it sound like we think parents who use IVF are murderers, or children who came from IVF, we wish they didn't exist?
I want to add one more group of people to those. I think there are probably pro-life people listening who have used IVF or have known people who have used IVF. I have a friend who has, and I don't know for sure which method she used, but I know that there are pro-life people who have struggled deeply with infertility, and that can be deeply, deeply painful for people. And I think often people don't understand all of what's going into IVF, or but there are all kinds of situations that could develop and all kinds of stories that there could be. But yeah, there are both pro-choice people and pro-life people who have experiences with IVF.
So some of my kind of initial thoughts in answering that question, and some of the things we discussed in our affiliate group call, was number one, making it very clear that the reason that we are pro-life is because we are pro-human. Like we love humans. And that means that yes, we don't think that humans should be allowed to be killed. Like, that's the reason we have a concern with IVF. But that also means we care about you. We care about you as a person standing in front of me. And if you are someone who was conceived in IVF, that doesn't mean you are any less worthy of life and you are deserving of the same protection from violence.
Yeah.
It's true that I don't like the process that had to happen. And I think it was wrong that there were some essentially brothers and sisters of yours that were killed as a result of that. I'm happy to talk about that, but I want to get very clear from the first moment of this conversation. I should honestly be assuming every pro-choice person who brings up IVF to me has some sort of experience with it.
Yes.
Because frankly, they very much might. Not a lot of people know about IVF at all. So if they're bringing it up, that means they've at least like read a long article about it or something. But it's very likely they have some sort of experience with it because they talk about it at all, whereas most people don't. And so trying to be very clear from the beginning, the reason that I am pro-life is because I'm pro-human. I think that humans deserve protection from violence, and I'm concerned that there are practices in our country, multiple practices in our country. Abortion is one of them. The practice of IVF is another one of them. Human trafficking is another one of them. Like, there's multiple practices happening in our country right now where humans are being exploited. Humans are being subject to violence.
Yes.
They're being not given the protections that they deserve under our law, and we're doing a really bad job of figuring out how to protect them effectively. Yep. That's what I'm concerned about. I am not here saying that someone who used IVF in order to have a baby is a bad person, because I think most people, just like I don't believe that women should be prosecuted if an abortion becomes illegal, I don't think that parents have the kind of mens rea that would justify like prosecuting or even calling them a murderer. Yeah. Because IVF is very much seen in our society as, hey, we're here to help you get pregnant, which is a wonderful, good thing. And most people don't know the process behind what's really happening, and also don't have the kind of understanding that we do about what an embryo actually is. And they make arguments like it would be wasteful to not do stem cell research on this because there isn't an agreement about what this is. There's not a knowledge and a belief of like, I am knowingly killing a human by doing this process. That is not there. And so I don't think that you are a bad person. I don't think that your parents are a bad person. But I have these concerns about violence that I see happening. And I think I have good arguments for why this should be considered violence and should be put in that same bucket with abortion, with human trafficking, with all these human rights violations that we should be protecting humans from.
Just before, I know we don't have time to talk about this, but you mentioned something that we have a really, really important article about that I just want to like spotlight real quick, as it's been coming up in some of like my meetings recently. So we have an article on why we don't believe at ERI that women should be prosecuted for abortions in like, you know, places with abortion bans. We've got a couple of articles on that. In fact, I just had a meeting with this guy. Like I connected with this guy from that article. He stumbled upon it because he had some friends who are kind of like, say, abolitionist leaning or trending, and found this to be like a super, super helpful resource, and then wanted more resources, and then we started chatting. So we have a resource. If you're wondering, like, wait a minute, that doesn't seem pro-life to not like go after all the people involved. Kind of, we have information on that, but we're not going to spend a bunch of podcast time talking about that more than we are right now. What you were describing, the pro-human kind of argument that you're making, I love this. I don't think I've heard a pro-life person speak as eloquently about this in a not religious way ever before. So this is really cool. It reminded me of a movie. I'm wondering if any of you have seen Gattaca.
Yes. Actually, I watched it in my high school biology class.
Nice. Okay.
No,
you have
sorry.
No idea what this is. Okay, that's fine. It's not, a lot of people haven't seen this. It's like, if you know, you know. There's like a lot of sci-fi nerds, not pro-life, but a lot of sci-fi nerds that kind of love Gattaca. There are things that kind of like, it's kind of like one of like the special, the kind of like indie, didn't really make it huge. But Gattaca kind of takes place, and this has been a really long time since I've seen it, but you know, it takes place in a kind of future dystopian world where, you know, what happens decades after everyone is using genetic engineering to reproduce. And so you see the scene in the beginning that's kind of like meant to be like, here's like just like the really common, like basically everyone uses IVF or their version of something like IVF to have babies, and they always select the best ones first. Like they have a bunch of multiples, and then they usher in the parents into this little counseling room. It's really weird. And it's like, here's the ultrasound, but it's like they're just single-celled embryos, they're just zygotes. And they're like, here are the 4 best options, kind of a thing. But, these few have like markers in them that they might get sick later. So obviously you wouldn't want those. This is clearly the best one, kind of thing. And it's like in the movie, it's like the fact that like, though it's being presented by the counselor as this really positive thing, like the writing and the filming and the music and everything is meant to like, this feels kind of icky. And it's like, what happens? Kind of the plot of the movie is what happens if one poor guy whose parents kind of had babies the old fashioned way, what happens when he has to try to compete with all of these other like, genetically quote unquote kind of perfect specimens of humans? How does he compete? And it's like, here is a movie that is showing in a really cool, really non-religious way what can happen when we kind of treat humans like commodities, and we start kind of like, the way that we order computers, I want this GPU and I want this CPU and I want this different thing. Like, it's like even the Protestants watching this to be like, maybe the Catholics have a point. Maybe this is not so good, maybe.
Right. I mean, that's a fabulous example of something that I would put in that secondary bucket of concerns, which I would want to bring up to a pro-choice person in a conversation. I want to be very clear. When Rebecca and I described this primary bucket of concerns and the secondary bucket, like I wanted everyone to realize that the primary bucket is all you really need.
Yeah.
We don't need the secondary bucket of concerns in order to convince a pro-choice person. And I think the majority of our arguments should be really living in that first bucket land. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't bring up the secondary concerns to a pro-choice person. And this is a really important one. Because even if we were to, in theory, do IVF the quote-unquote pro-life way, the one-at-a-time embryo method, that doesn't take away these other secondary concerns, like how just the idea that we are going to create humans in this artificial way, that is inherently using eugenics. It is inherently trying to decide which ones do we not want, or at least it inherently allows for that. Allows for us to take a look, like do this in an artificial kind of perfect way and try to create something that we wouldn't be able to create naturally. I think it's inherently tied there in a way that is kind of inescapable from just the fact that this is an industry meant to commodify humans.
Yes, I have a question about that. I agree that it's like uncomfortably close. It like if you create humans in a lab, there's like more of an opportunity, more of a pause step. It's easier to do the step of like deciding which ones to allow to live and which ones to kill based on which ones look the healthiest or which ones you want for other reasons, other traits that you want to select for. But I think my question is, imagine a pro-life person who understands how IVF works is going to use IVF because she and her husband really want to get pregnant, or she and her partner. And she it tells the doctor very clearly, we're going to create 2 embryos or whatever, and we're going to implant them both in my uterus, and we're going to let them both survive if they can both survive. It seems like there's not actually eugenics happening there. There's not selection based on traits. And there's not like choosing some humans to allow to live based on those traits and killing other humans. So Emily, I'm curious, like in that specific scenario, where do you see, is it eugenics? Is it just something uncomfortably close to eugenics? What's happening there that's the specific method of concern, like in that particular instance?
Yeah, I think you're right that particular instance does not use eugenics, but I'm talking about, I think the industry, like the existence of the industry whatsoever is inherently tied to trying to create perfect humans. And even if we weren't like killing certain ones, if we were only creating one at a time, we would still be living, I think, inherently in a culture of, okay, we're trying to maximize the effectiveness of these embryos. We're going to try to create lab settings where they are able to perfectly develop in a way that if an embryo is developing in a woman's body might not be perfect. There's external factors. There's things that she's eating. There's things that are happening. Like, we are trying to force through this artificial lab, this even one embryo that we created, because we only created one and we only wanted to implant one. But we are inherently trying to say that there is a quote unquote perfect human. There is like a platonic form of a perfect human and what that would look like. And we are going to try to create the perfect setting for that one singular human to be able to grow an implant. I think there's an inherent difference in trying to create an artificially perfect environment for a human to grow that the industry is like going to be putting down, that is different than how we think about it when there is just a baby that's growing inside of my body or some other woman's body. Like, my body and that woman's body are different, and our baby are going to come out slightly differently because of the genes there, but also because of what happened in my body for those 9 months. So I don't think it's possible for an IVF industry to not still be thinking about the question of what makes a perfect human, how can we try to prevent unperfect humans, even if we're not going to kill, quote unquote, unperfect humans, but how do we recreate the right environment so that no, quote, unperfect humans result from this process?
Yeah. So clarification question, I think. How is the process and like concerns that you have about the process of like trying to create a environment to promote health or long-term health, whatever, or like promote particular traits in embryos in a lab, like different, obviously there are lots of differences. I'm asking like which ones are morally relevant for you, from like taking prenatal vitamins or promoting health in a woman's body in order to try to promote health in the baby's body. And also, of course, for the woman's own sake. But obviously in general, in pregnancy for a very, very long time, we've done what we can to promote health in babies and in women, in part, not in whole, but in part because we want the babies to survive and to be healthy when they arrive. Obviously, people who have birth defects or other forms of disabilities or health conditions as a result of things that happen during pregnancy or in the process of fertilization can have deeply meaningful and valuable lives. And also, we want to prevent their lives from being hard in those particular ways when we can.
Yeah. I think I'm very much processing this as I go. This is not something I've ever articulated before, but I think my primary uncomfortability with it, my primary like reason it gets connected to eugenics in my mind is very related to the idea of Down syndrome in Iceland. So we've talked about this before. There are places in Europe where things like Down syndrome have been basically eradicated by the ability to do testing, genetic testing, while the baby is in utero, figure out that this baby has Down syndrome or is very, very likely to have Down syndrome. And then abortion is highly, highly encouraged. And so we have very few babies being born with Down syndrome in these countries. Like, I believe in Iceland, there's about 2 babies born with Down syndrome in the entire country each year. Like, that's insane. And because of that, not only do I think there's like a eugenics problem of we are devaluing and we are telling parents your baby can't have a good life, it has a Down syndrome, we're going to push abortion on you. But I also think there's a secondary problem now for those 2 babies that are born with Down syndrome, is they are now living in a country where it's been made kind of clear through society that they aren't wanted. It would have been a better decision if their parents had gotten rid of them. Right. And that society doesn't feel much of an obligation to actually help them, to provide resources for them, because they're just so rare that there's really no need for that. And I see a similar fear in this Gattaca world, where let's assume that Gattaca is happening, except it's in a place where we're doing it, quote unquote, the pro-life way. Like, everybody's creating their babies through IVF, except we're just doing one at a time. That way we're not killing the extras. And then there's this one poor guy whose parents made him the natural way, and he didn't have that perfect lab environment. Yes, we should be using prenatal vitamins. We should be trying to make things healthier. But I think there is like an inherent healthiest that we could create in some perfect lab setting that we're going to be trying to get to. And it creates this culture of the idea of, if you weren't created that way, if you aren't perfect, if you aren't meeting that platonic ideal, then you are lesser. You are not worthy of our society's help. We have no obligations to do so. So I think that's more where I'm seeing the eugenics come in. There is both the problem of like actually trying to create this perfect lab setting, and then there's the problem of how are we treating the people that weren't created in that setting out here once they've all been born. I'm watching Josh like very much process what I just said. I'm so curious what you're thinking.
Yeah, it's really
right now.
interesting. So on one hand, so I guess I wonder how much is of the discomfort that you're feeling has to do with the what has happened after fertilization. There is this like screening thing that happens, like just like imagine a scan, just like, okay, markers, here's like all of potential, oh, not going to have good vision, great musician, like all of whatever those possible things are, like all of that. As soon as that happens, it feels like we're on a really slippery slope towards like, obviously you're going to like not pick the kid that's going to have cancer later if you can tell that or whatever. Like, it might not be as obvious as we want to pick, the musicians over the not musicians or whatever. Like, you might like, so you get that. I wonder, like, again, if IVF has already been moving in a direction of single embryo transfers anyway, was at least possible or plausible. What if also then, let's just imagine it's a thought experiment, like America decided like we all have seen Gattaca and we're like, not this. We're not gonna go that direction. We do want maybe society on a whole says, like, I'm not trying to be offensive, but maybe society as a whole says like we don't agree with the Catholics. We're not gonna say like you can't use technology like at all, but we don't want to be doing this whole selection thing where we're picking the top 1 out of 10 or 20 or even 2 or 4 embryos. So we're going to do a thing where you get all the ones that you make, and maybe you get them all at the same time, or we're not going to put them in a certain order. If that was happening, how does that take care of some of the concern? Because my concern about like the Gattaca example is like the Gattaca example is meant to be an extreme version of this. It's meant to be, they are picking out, like they are screening out all of the kids who could have had any kinds of health issues at all, or bad eyesight or anything. So if you want to be an astronaut, it's really stinking hard, it turns out, like in that context. But like, we might not go that far, though, at least in theory. So I think that's my main question, is like how much of the heavy lifting is happening in the part that feels like the selection, we're doing this scan and choosing, and that part that starts feeling really eugenics-y really quickly.
I don't think in my thought experiment there's any choosing going on, though. If we're already assuming that we're living in this more pro-life IVF world where we're only creating one embryo and only implanting one embryo at a time, it's more of the thought of this creation of this idealistic lab to try to create the perfect human. Because I imagine in this world, like, I guess there is an assumption going on here that humans are not perfect, and I don't think we're inherently capable of just being fine with there being a Down syndrome. Like, let's say, okay, here we go. Let's say that you're using IVF. We create one embryo. We find out that embryo did have Down syndrome, but we implanted it. We did all the things, we didn't kill it because we're not supposed to do that. But now the people who are running that lab are like, shoot, we created an embryo that ended up having Down syndrome. That's a problem. People aren't going to want to use our lab anymore. We better figure out some ways to make our lab environment better so that we're not resulting in babies, or that our lab is going to have single embryos that are coming out. So like, I think there's an inherent, as soon as we are taking it out of this natural context, there's like human desire to be making and perfecting this that I think is inherent in the IVF industry. I think the fact that we have made an industry that commodifies humans, that says we can make a human for you because you want one, very legitimately. And I don't mean that at all in a derogatory way, but like, because you want a human, we can make a human for you and give it to you. There is an inherently now a capitalism part of this industry that says like, we want to create the best humans. We're going to try to like turn this into like going to the grocery store, even if I'm only creating one and I'm not killing anything.
Okay, I think I know why I disagree. I think in my mind, the lab has very little to do with trying to like the quality of the lab or the machines or anything like that having anything to do with the quality of the embryos that get created. Like, I'm sort of assuming that at any decent lab, if you put these gametes together, they're going to end up, we're going to end up with embryos. And the embryos, like the health level or the, potential, things that might happen down the road that we might be able to tell via DNA test or whatever. I imagine they're having everything to do with the DNA of the parents. And so you might end up with, with some parents, you might end up with different ratios of, let's say, quote unquote, healthy versus non-healthy, healthy babies or embryos. But I guess I'm not assuming that the lab, like the existence of the lab being as connected to we're trying to create a perfect baby. Like, I think they're trying to create healthy babies, but I don't know if they're actually in their mind, wanting to do the Gattaca thing. Like, we want everyone to be this kind of perfect ideal. Come back at me.
I think maybe where our disconnect is from my actual experience being pregnant.
Okay.
There are
absurd
amounts of recommendations out there about what I should and should not be doing when I'm pregnant. Like, I'm not pregnant right now, but when I was pregnant. And people disagree about which things you're supposed to. Am I allowed to eat soft cheese, or is that not? Am I not allowed to eat soft cheese?
Zero coffee, 1 cup of coffee, 2 cups of coffee.
Exactly. How much caffeine am I what is going to help my child the most? And I read through a million of those recommendations, and ultimately, if you really want to, you can find a doctor on the internet arguing for anything that you want them to argue for. Like, if you really want to eat soft cheese, congratulations. You can find a doctor who's telling you to eat soft cheese. If you think that it's a bad idea to eat soft cheese, you can find a doctor who's telling you that's the worst thing in the world and your child will come out with green skin because you ate soft cheese. Okay? You can find anything. And so there is an inherent thing that's happening there as a pregnant mother where you're having to make some decisions about what makes sense for you and your baby, and what do you feel comfortable, what level of risk do you feel comfortable with, or whatever. All those decisions are things that they're going to have to decide in this lab. They're going to have to decide what kind of because you can't literally just leave this embryo sitting in this petri disk and not give it any nutrients or anything. There has to be some sort of, if we're going to grow it for a while, we're giving it things to allow it to survive.
Right.
And the same kinds of decisions about what nutrients are we giving versus not giving, what vitamins in what quantities. One of the things I remember from my very first doctor's appointment is they wanted me to pick out which exact prenatal vitamin I was going to take, because different prenatal vitamins have different percentages of each of these vitamins within it, because there's 20 vitamins in the prenatal vitamin.
Oh, no.
And so they wanted to make sure, are you picking one that has at least 15% choline? I'm making this up. I don't remember what percentage, but we have to make decisions about all those things. And then there was 10 different ones they were fine with me picking that I got to pick from, based on which one I thought tasted better or which one was a smaller pill size that I could swallow easily. But there's a million little decisions like that, that this lab essentially is going to now get to create, unless we're, I don't know, are we allowing every parent to individually choose all the nutrients that are going into this? But I think there is an inherent trying to figure out what is the perfect way to grow a child in order to have them be as healthy as humanly possible, in a way that we don't, we think about that to an extent when the woman is pregnant, and that's good. We should be having these conversations about is it safe to eat soft cheese, or is it not safe to eat soft cheese? I'm glad there are doctors that are thinking about that and can give me some recommendations. But what I don't like, and where it feels like an inherent commodification, an inherent desire to create a perfect child, is when we're going to be now sitting around and having this whole board of doctors probably staring at millions of embryos and saying, okay, how can we make sure that all of these are as healthy as possible? We're going to feed them all the exact same percentage of this versus this versus this. And then if a bunch of them don't turn out well, we're going to reevaluate likely what those percentages were and say, is there anything we could have done to make them more perfect? It feels like an extra level of scrutiny that individual pregnant woman doesn't get. I got a certain level of scrutiny, but ultimately I got to make a choice about whether I wanted to eat soft cheese or not. No one was actually staring down my neck and trying to make sure I didn't eat soft cheese when I went out. There's another level of scrutiny happening in this lab that I don't think is avoidable.
Yeah, I think that's put some clarity on it for me. I think I agree with you that, all right, I think this is probably a point of agreement, that like there's a danger of like this desire to create a perfect, quote unquote, perfect baby. I don't think there's really any such thing. But that
maximally healthy baby.
Yeah. Something. I think there's, a danger of that kind of outlook either way. I imagine you read some internet resources when you were pregnant that were very much in the, like, you have to do exactly this thing in order to have a maximally healthy baby. And like, there are like obsessive resources out there, I imagine, for pregnant women now trying to create the perfect environment to create the quote perfect baby. So I think the danger, at least my view, at least at this particular moment, is that the danger of that is there both in a lab setting and in just natural pregnancy. I think I'm trying to puzzle out like whether, and if so, why there would be like more of a danger of that in a lab setting. It sounds like you're thinking because doctors are like making these decisions in mass, and yet like I imagine
it's both in mass and regulated. Like there would be inherently, like if we're requiring, in theory, in this pro-life world, we're requiring when you do IVF, you're only allowed to make one embryo and you're only allowed to put it in. There is inherent government regulation around this, which, by the way, is another item in that secondary concerns box about the US, where there are like no regulations around IVF whatsoever. And it's just this, it's literally been called the Wild West of IVF.
Yeah,
because
that's true.
They just, anybody can walk into a cryogenic freezer tank in Atlanta. I think it was Atlanta. We had that crazy news story like 2 years ago, and we have to try to figure out what to do. And these embryos are suddenly getting killed because some patient in the hospital wandered in. Okay, there is no regulation around any of this. And that's a huge problem that we have that's kind of unique to us versus Europe, where it is highly regulated by their own governments. We don't have that in the United States. And that kind of environment, I think, would be inherent to if we are requiring a quote unquote pro-life world. Like if we've already assumed that it is wrong to do IVF as it is currently done in the United States, we've already like put that to bed. Now we're arguing like, is there still something bad there, even if we did it that more pro-life way, even if we only made one embryo and only implanted one embryo? I think that world would require the kinds of crazy government regulation that would mean that's the only way people are actually doing it. There would be laws around it. There would be standards and boards and people having to like analyze, are we doing this correctly? I think that regulation, it's happening in a lab. It's people making decisions en masse for millions of embryos, and it's being regulated by the government as we have to do it X way. I think that's where I'm seeing the like, there is an inherent government. Like I don't see there's a world where there's not at that point a Department of creating embryos. It is part of the government who is, like your Department of Education. They're like the overarching board that's like analyzing all these IVF labs and making sure that they're meeting all of the requirements. They're doing all the things they're supposed to. And by the way, I don't know how we are not thinking about, okay, are we giving them the right percentages of this? And we're comparing this lab's output to this lab's output to make sure we're making the best kids that we can.
So I think of that as kind of analogous. That's really helpful. I think of that as kind of analogous, and I'm guessing you don't. So I'm curious, like where the analogy breaks down for you, to like a hospital deciding, okay, here's the type of formula that we're going to have on hand for our babies in the NICU or just babies who are at the hospital who are full term, but we're caring for them for now. And this is the kind of formula that we are going to use for all of the babies who are here. Like that is going to be a hospital decision unless it's an individual parent decision, or like maybe it's not formula. Maybe there is a way to like give parents a choice about formula, but not about like what percentage oxygen is in NICU. I'm not sure what the precise term is, but the care units, machines that we keep babies in the NICU. Like there are mass decisions being made about how we care for babies that are trying to optimize these babies' chance of survival. I wonder if what's going on for you to some degree is like the lack of personalization. I know that like babies in the NICU actually really need skin to skin contact, ideally with parents, ideally with mom.
Yes.
And like there's a way of like trying to optimize all of this and trying not to have any contamination that actually resulted in more babies dying because they weren't prioritizing skin to skin contact, because it's complicated and like could introduce germs and all of these things. And if you're trying to create a really sterile environment and ignoring that human element, I wonder if that might be, I think that's a point where I would want to be concerned and have questions about creating humans in a lab and how are we caring for them and personalizing even very, very young humans. Yeah, so I'm curious, if you agree that like personalizing and having like almost relational contact is part of the danger of this like sterile lab environment. And then I'm curious what, if any, pushback you would have on the idea that in the same way that it makes sense, even though there might be some downsides or potential pitfalls for a hospital to decide, here's the formula we're going to use, here's the percentage oxygen we're going to use for all these babies to optimize their health, if the same thing applies to lab environments in IVF.
That's a very good question. And I don't know. I think absolutely the personalization is part of it for me. I don't think that that's 100% of my, like, it's not directly related to kind of the inherent eugenics that I see in it, like of the inherent commodification part. But I do think that is a concern that I have, is the lack of personalization there and the just making blanket decisions for millions of these embryos in theory. But the formula thing feels, I mean, that does feel different to me because of the personalization. I mean, I remember when I was in the hospital, one of the very first questions the nurses asked me after my baby was born was, what is your feeding plan for this baby? And if we have to take this baby to the NICU, we plan to follow that. So would you like us to use donor milk? Would you like us to use formula? Like, we get to still make those decisions. So that does feel different because it's personalized in that way. But it also feels different in that this is not kind of typically a long-term thing, in the same way that like creating this embryo and housing it for a while, making sure it's going to be healthy, like that's very much at the beginning of its life cycle, as opposed to when I'm thinking of a NICU baby, I'm thinking of someone who is getting temporary help for something that is wrong with it. Like there is a disease here, there is a malfunction in their body system when they came out, and we are trying to help them in order to like get them back to health. That feels different from I am trying to create this embryo from scratch to be as healthy as possible with like pumping in certain levels of different vitamins, oxygen, different nutrients, not introducing these other kinds of nutrients, which bacteria are getting in and are healthy, and which ones do we not want this baby to have exposure to? What kinds of music are they listening to? All the ridiculous things that you can read articles on that I should be doing while pregnant. That feels different than like temporary help along the way in this baby's life when something has happened. And maybe the thing that has gone wrong is they got out of their mother's belly too early. They're just premature and we have to like help them get back to healthy. Or maybe it's because there is something wrong with their lungs and they're struggling. We have to help them. I don't know. That feels different to me than the creation process from the beginning. I can't put my finger on why. And I'm thinking maybe we should move on to kind of like the last piece of this conversation, just because I feel like I'm not sure I'm going to know why in the next 4 seconds when I have only been thinking about this for the last 25 minutes. But that's kind of what's going on in my brain.
Yeah.
So here's maybe some common ground, if nothing else. Like the kind of like picture that like Rebecca and I have been kind of playing around with in this conversation of like this like potential alternative, like more pro-life possible reality is like not one that probably exists right now. I'm thinking of this embryonic stem cell researcher that I spoke to a long time ago, Dr. Steve Stice. I've talked about him several times before, but he was at UGA and he did embryonic stem cell research, and I wanted to interview with him because I wanted to talk to someone who actually does that and not just read pro-lifers talking about them that were doing that. And like I remember there being something that he was complaining about that I didn't have the empathy for him that he was like looking for, but he was very kind of annoyed with the, George W. Bush's sort of like the way that everything had gone down on stem cell research was he had a lab that was a mixed lab. He had kind of 2 different labs because he had a lab where he could do the stuff that was federally funded, and they couldn't do human embryonic stem cell research. They couldn't do certain things. They could do other things, but they couldn't do that with federal funding. they never talked about banning it. Like he was doing it on the, like, not on the side. He was doing it in a different lab, but he was like, it's got to be a different build. Like, I don't remember all the different things, but he's like, we got to use like different like spreadsheets and funding sources and like all these things. It's like this whole like big pain in the neck. And I was just like, yeah, I don't know. I don't care that much. Like, if you've got if we're trying to do our best to like at least separate federal tax dollars from going to kill embryos for their body parts, because a whole bunch of pro-lifers don't feel comfortable with it. Like, if you've got to go through some more work to like try to figure out that, like, I'm kind of fine with that. And Emily, sort of like, you remind me a little bit of that in the sense that, like, there's I think a really right concern for like, okay, yes, you could try to do it the most pro-life way, but like once you're in the lab and you're doing all these different things, and a lot of those same things are often being used for these other ways, like it just starts getting closer and closer and closer to feeling like concerning. And it'd be like, and it seems like it'd be more ideal if we could like more, I don't know, like either bifurcate things or, I'm just recognizing that the world in my head is not the one that probably exists, but I'm interested in talking about it to try to figure out what are the actual, like, the differences between the way that you're thinking about and the way that I am, and how should that change? And yeah, I'm still processing too.
Yeah, we have a lot of processing.
I think we have just demonstrated admirably the point that we made at the beginning of this, which is that there are some primary concerns that all pro-lifers should have and should be crystal clear on. Namely, this is a human rights violation. We are killing prenatal humans. This is exactly what pro-life people are all about preventing. And then there's this really messy world of other things that we should be talking about and should be kind of trying to get to the bottom of, that Catholics might have particular doctrines on, and Protestants of various stripes, and atheists and people of other religions too, and that are like really complicated and interesting questions that we need to talk about, and also that we might have more disagreement around, and that we need to very clearly distinguish from the primary concern, namely that as IVF is typically practiced, it involves killing prenatal humans. So we've got this really messy bucket that's really interesting, and that we've just done some admirable demonstration of how messy it can get and how different pro-lifers can disagree and have an awesome time talking about it. And then we've got the really clear bucket. This is a human rights violation. This is killing prenatal humans.
So when you're talking about this with a pro-choice person, I think it's really important to stay primarily in that primary concerns bucket. I think it is okay and good to dip your toe into the secondary concerns bucket, especially if you're passionate about one of those secondary concerns. Like, I would feel okay telling a pro-choice person, like, I also do have this concern a little bit that, like, when we're commodifying humans, like when we're doing IVF, there is an inherent commodification eugenics thing that I see is happening there. I have this extra uncomfy thing. I think it's okay to bring that up. I think it's bad, though, if you live in that camp forever, which is where I think a lot of pro-lifers that I hear talk about IVF start and live in that secondary concerns camp for pretty much the entire time. Other secondary concerns they bring up might be more explicitly religious than mine. Like, mine is more of a human rights eugenic-y land, but I've heard a lot of Catholics bring up, IVF rejects God's design for married love. I am Catholic. I believe that is true. That sentence I just said, I do think is true. But you're not going to hear me say that to a pro-choice person because I don't think it's helpful, okay? Yeah. And that's the other place that I think this sometimes gets sticky, is we may want to, and I think we should, talk about a third thing with pro-choice people. We should bring up the primary concerns. We should maybe dip our toe for a second into some secondary concerns, or maybe your secondary concern is about how unregulated it is in the US. You can dip your toe in there. That's true. That's a very scary thing. But I also want to be able to provide this pro-choice person with alternatives, with being able to say, look, I do actually want women who are struggling to get pregnant, or couples who are struggling to get pregnant. I want to provide them with quality healthcare that's going to help them get pregnant. And the place we often get stuck here, though, is that other alternative healthcare is very much labeled as Catholic, but it doesn't have to be. And so I want to take a hot second to talk about NAPRO technology and how cool NAPRO technology is, and the fact that we don't have to talk about it from a super Catholic setting. Yeah. Like, NAPRO technology itself is awesome, and the things that it can do is awesome. Oh, by the way, it happens to be Catholic. Whereas I hear most Catholics go about that the other direction and be like, there's this amazing medical technology that respects God's design for married love. And right there, you have just lost them. Okay. Please do not start your sentence that way. Because they probably don't care. I would love to, like, from an evangelism perspective, yes, I would love for them to know by the time I get to the end talking about NAPRO technology, oh, by the way, it also came out of Catholics. Isn't that cool? Don't Catholics do really cool work in bioethics? And, like, let that be the start of a cool conversation about why I love Catholicism. But let's not start there. So hold on. Let me back up for a second. If anyone, because there's probably a bunch of you who were like me a few years ago that I just said the phrase NAPRO technology and you went, wait, what? Please pause. What the heck is NAPRO technology? So NAPRO technology is basically a blanket term for any kind of medical intervention, medical care that thinks about infertility as a symptom rather than in itself like a disease or the problem. So it tries to understand that if you are experiencing infertility, if you're struggling to get pregnant or to stay pregnant, there is something else going on, either in your body or in the other person's body, that is causing that infertility to happen. And if we can figure out what that root cause is, we can treat that root cause. And now it's very likely you will be able to get pregnant or stay pregnant, whatever it was that you were struggling with. And so NAPRO technology tries to examine what is going on in your body that is causing the infertility. Let's go in with some interventions that might be surgical interventions, that might be like righting hormonal imbalances, that might be dietary changes. Like, let's try to figure out what's going on. How can we fix that thing? And now you're able to get pregnant. So as I said, a couple different examples of that. Surgeries can often be used. There can be things like giving you extra supplements of certain vitamins. There can be things like doing dietary changes. You've got a variety of kind of like both medical and surgical interventions. And what that typically does is when it writes that, it creates this chance for you to get pregnant that's actually much higher than IVF. This is my favorite part. This is where I want to like start when I'm talking with most pro-choice people. I want to say, I think that people should have access to healthcare that helps them to get pregnant by actually fixing the problem of why they're not getting pregnant. Like, I think a lot of doctors these days really want to just kind of circumvent the problem and say, hey, you're struggling to get pregnant. Here, we'll take care of it for you. We will get you pregnant by like creating the pregnancy here and just plopping it inside your body and praying that it survives, or plopping multiple inside your body so that we can account the fact that a bunch of them won't survive. Instead of saying, as I think we should be doing with all healthcare, hey, what is wrong? Why is your body not doing this thing that it should be able to do naturally? Let's see if we can fix that and get your body, your holistic body, to a healthier state so that it is capable of getting pregnant. And so when we do that, we can have amazing success rates. So I want to grab the actual success rates right now because I want to make sure I'm not like pulling them off of the top of my head. So the like success rate of artificial fertility treatments, IVF being one of them, but if they're lumped together, there's multiple kinds of artificial fertility treatments like that. Those have a success rate of 31 to 33%. NAPRO technology, as used after failed artificial fertility treatments. So if you're someone that has tried artificial fertility treatments first, then you come to NAPRO technology, that has a success rate of 52.8%. Wow. The success rate of NAPRO technology as the initial treatment of infertility, if you go down that route first before trying anything else, is 80%.
Wow.
That's insane. Like, even if I had no problems with IVF whatsoever, like if I thought IVF was completely moral, even in the way we're currently doing it, I want more people to know about NAPRO technology because it is far more successful at actually helping you to get pregnant.
And like, maybe without spending 20 grand.
And without spending 20 grand, because that's the other thing, is NAPRO technology is much, much cheaper. So a typical round, a single cycle of IVF can cost between $12,000 and $25,000. That is what Trump said in an executive order. He's right about that. It is crazy expensive. And it's also not covered by health insurance because it's like deemed this extra bonus thing. Whereas NAPRO technology, a single round of NAPRO technology typically is costing vastly less than that. Depends exactly, are you having a surgery, are you having treatment, but it's averaging like $1,000. And it is typically covered by health insurance because it is covered as part of women's health. It's fixing, oh, you have low progesterone, so we want to try to help with that. And so that's covered by health insurance. That's not a bonus thing. That's you being a more healthy woman. Yeah. And so not only is it wildly more successful, but it's also much cheaper. And so we should be offering this to anyone who is infertile, even if we live in a world where we're doing IVF perfectly morally and all of my concerns are gone. Shouldn't we be trying this much less invasive, much cheaper, and much more successful intervention first that's actually going to make the woman healthier? And then if that doesn't work, okay, now we can try this, like, get around the problem by just plopping a fetus inside of her thing. Like, I want people to know that that's a thing and that I very much support it. And when I'm talking to a pro-choice person, that's the angle I want to take. I want to say, look, I am not, let's go back to this from the beginning. I am pro-human. I am anti-violence against innocent humans. That's why I don't like the way that IVF is practiced. I am not anti-women being able to get pregnant or like women's freedom to be able to try to have a baby. I don't think that there is such a thing as like the complete freedom to have a baby, because even if I can't control that. I can't say that you absolutely have the right to decide and instantly become pregnant. That's not the way the world works. I don't have the freedom to decide to not have cancer. Like, I can just get it spontaneously. This is a natural thing. It's not a thing I have. But I do think that, like, we should be helping people who want to get pregnant to get pregnant. And I know that there's medical technologies out there that do that don't have these same kinds of problems. And I think that's something me and this pro-choice person should be able to agree on. We should be able to say, this technology is awesome. More people should know about it. More people should be offering it as kind of the first round of care before IVF, if you're a doctor who has someone who's infertile. All of that is amazing, and that's the direction that I want to go. The problem is, I often hear Catholics like me start by talking about how, isn't this so cool that we have this medical technology that helps people get pregnant, that respects God's design for married love. And I just want to crawl into a hole. Like, I was looking at so many NAPRO technology websites in order to write this article that Rebecca and I are working on. And so many of them, I'm not gonna name names, but so many of them, like, that is the tagline. It's like, are you Catholic and looking for a way? Like, oh, please, can we talk about the Catholicness later? Can we let that be a bonus, awesome thing that helps other people realize that the Catholic Church is cool and our teachings are cool and, like, the work we've been doing in bioethics is cool? Because the coolest thing about IVF, or the coolest thing about NAPRO technology, is the fact that it works and it helps women, and it doesn't do a million extra interventions that we don't need when there's something actually fundamentally unhealthy and we can make her healthier. Like, I am pro healthcare that holistically helps women instead of ignoring problems. And that's what NAPRO technology does. And then, oh, by the way, it also comes from a really cool Catholic place. And it does respect God's design for married love. That's cool and awesome. And I can talk about why I think God's design for married love is important. But can that please be secondary to this conversation after we've talked about just how cool NAPRO technology is and the fact that I think it's sad more people don't know you can do this?
So you wanted my live reaction to what you guys have been working on. And interestingly, I think my main reaction is the same one that I had listening to you explain the NAPRO technology thing, Emily, which is that, you know, we don't talk about it in this way very much, but like something that I think that we're trying to do at ERI is analogous to, you know, there are Christian apologists that try to help Christians to not use quote unquote Christianese, right? Mm-hmm. Like, we just get used to certain phrases and language and bumper sticker slogans and things. And like, we just like hear things and they may not always make a ton of sense, but we heard it enough growing up that we just start parroting these things. And we're trying to help pro-life people to not do that, to have a not being weird. How do we explain these things in non-weird ways and non kind of super religious or super political, you know, or something like what are some better, and just the listening. I've never heard someone describe like the value. I've heard a lot of people describe the value of using NAPRO technology and not in just religious ways, but they've never done as well as you just did. And I think that's the same case as like when you were describing, you know, what you guys were figuring out on how to talk about IVF was similar, was like, this is not the typical way for pro-lifers to talk about IVF. I think it would be like, on his face, my reaction like, that would be way more persuasive than what I think you've accomplished the goal. This is exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to help people to be more persuasive and communicate better. But I think you just did that really well on the NAPRO technology thing too. Like, there are ways to talk about these things in ways that are just not as kind of weird or off-putting to outsiders. So that was thought number one. And the only other thing I wanted to say was, I want to kind of throw a big that would be mixing metaphors. I want to tip my cap to the Catholics for a moment here, because now that I've done a little debating with Catholic theology, sort of a little bit in this episode, I want to say Steve Wagner, my friend Steve Wagner, said something to me one time. This is a private conversation, but I'll never forget. And I think I don't know how many dozens of times I've quoted it, but it's good for Protestants to be reminded. While Protestants rarely spend as much time as Catholics do thinking about birth control methods and fertility and how and all of these different things and what should we and should we not do, like Protestants a lot of times end up thinking differently, but like a lot of times it's because they're not thinking about it hardly at all. Like at least Catholics are taking this seriously and really thinking really, really hard about it in a way that a lot of Protestants they're not thinking about until years and years into the marriage. It's like, oh, I wonder what, that kind of thing. It's like, so I just want to say, I am so thankful for my Catholic brothers and sisters that have forced me to, and a lot of my Protestant, brethren and sisterin, to think about this more serious, in a way that they should have been thinking about it more seriously. And maybe you guys are right in the end. I'm open to that possible. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe you guys are right. But at least appreciate how seriously you treat it, because I think that is Protestants should be closer to that versus me trying to get Catholics to come our way. Don't think about it less. Keep thinking about it a lot. This is really, really good. And if we can come together and do this kind of thing, like we kind of spontaneously ended up doing today, how much better would the world be? Man, this is what we need to be doing. This is good. So maybe just as one kind of final kind of thought, I think this shows the value of having a diverse pro-life movement. I mean, just think of the really cool things that happens when you get really smart Catholics and really smart Protestants and really smart non-religious people like Monica Snyder and all these other people that we know. The really smart LGBTQ folks that have really interesting things to say too. The really smart liberal lefty types. What happens when you get all those people together? It can be a little bit tricky and complicated sometimes. But we could get better at this. But theoretically, if we all get together and really just kind of let our put our egos down, get our defenses down, which is really hard for all of us, but have those conversations and let that iron sharpen iron in a way. I think we have not yet seen what could happen if a lot of the pro-life movement and a lot of the pro-life leaders were doing that really well on a regular basis. And it would be really, really cool to see what could happen. And could we try to inspire a culture of that, in the clubs, this should be a part of the culture of the clubs. It's yes, you're Catholic, awesome. You're Protestant, awesome. You're not, you're none of those things, awesome, welcome, all those things, because then we can try to figure the stuff out together and get kind of the best thoughts from all the different sides. So, boy, it's going to be a while before I figure out a different way to end our podcast. Then I love podcasting with Emily and Rebecca. This is so fun. This is how it's just been for a really, really long time. So this has been really fun. Thank you both for being here and giving me a lot of things to think about. I'm going to be thinking about this conversation for a really long time now. We might end up having to have a follow-up. Interested in questions, thoughts that people have, post them in the comments below where you see them. Tell us what are your thoughts? What would you add to this conversation? Protestants, what are some of the other things that you've learned from Catholics about this topic? I'd love to see that in the comments, and vice versa. Catholics, have you learned anything from Protestants in this area? I would love to hear about that too. That would be really interesting. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Equipped for Life podcast, a project of Equal Rights Institute. Equal Rights Institute uses speaking, writing, YouTube videos, podcasts, online courses, and campus outreach to help pro-life advocates in the areas of practical dialogue tips, relational apologetics, pro-life philosophy, and sidewalk counseling. If you've been helped by this podcast, please consider supporting it by making a donation at equalrightsinstitute.com.